They knew what freedom felt like. They knew this wasn't what they were made for, and they fought to their last breath. Slavery will remain the darkest, ugliest, and most oppressed chapter of human history. There exist many versions of this chapter where people have tried to right all the wrongs, but the truth remains that injustice cannot be concealed indefinitely. Today, we'll uncover the harsh reality of slavery, but before we move forward, make sure you've subscribed to this channel and turned on the notifications. Around 1619, a Portuguese slave ship named São João Bautista sailed across the Atlantic Ocean with its hull packed full of human cargo, captive Africans from Angola, located in southwestern Africa. These men, women, and children, probably hailing from the kingdoms of Ndongo and Congo, endured a harrowing journey destined for a life of enslavement in Mexico. The arrival of Africans aboard the White Lion, a Dutch man-of-war ship transporting enslaved individuals from the west coast of Africa, marked the first documented instance of Africans arriving in the English-speaking colony that would later become Virginia. Colonist John Rolfe reported the arrival of the ship. He wrote, "About the latter end of August, a Dutch man-of-war of the burden of a 160 tons arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Joe. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. And 20 and odd Negroes were captured from the kingdom of Ndongo and Angola. They were among more than 350 enslaved Africans crammed aboard the São João Bautista, a Portuguese slave ship that departed from the African coast. Its destination was what was then known as Veracruz, situated on the coast of Mexico. During that time, forced labor wasn't unusual. Africans and Europeans had traded goods and people across the Mediterranean for centuries. However, enslavement wasn't previously based on race. The transatlantic slave trade, starting in the 15th century, brought in a new system. Slavery became commercialized, racialized, and hereditary. Enslaved individuals were dehumanized and viewed merely as commodities for trade and exploitation. Although people of African descent, both free and enslaved, had been in North America since the 1500s, the sale of the 20 and odd Africans marked the beginning of slavery in the United States. This marked the beginning of an era where inhumanity knew no bounds. There wasn't even a single day when these slaves weren't tortured for simply existing. The conditions in which they were transported were inhumane. James Horn, the historian and president of the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, described it, saying the ship was overcrowded. It suffered horrible mortality on the voyage to Veracruz. During the middle of the voyage on the high seas, the misery of black slaves continued. The ship carrying slaves faced an attack by two English pirate ships, the Treasurer and the White Lion, seeking to plunder gold. Instead, they discovered human cargo. The English boarded the ship and divided the enslaved people between the White Lion and the Treasurer. Several weeks later, the White Lion docked at Point Comfort in Virginia. Its captain traded the enslaved individuals for food. Among those traded were a man and woman who were later named Antony and Isabel, and whose baby would become the first documented African baby baptized in English North America. The Africans were most likely put to work in the tobacco fields that had recently been established in the area. The journey of these forcefully abducted people was full of fear and torture. No one knew what their fate would be, if they would even be alive or not. The first-hand account of a formerly enslaved man named Caesar tells the ugly reality of the slave trade. "The iron entered into our souls," Caesar said, recalling the shackles he had to endure during his forced journey from his home in Africa to the New World. These shackles, used as restraints around the arm and legs, were made of coarse metal that cut into the skin of captive Americans throughout the many months spent at sea. The worst of the most, children constituted approximately 26% of the captives during the transatlantic slave trade. Enslavers found children particularly advantageous because governments determined how many people could be accommodated on a slave ship by the ton. Children could occupy the ship's limited spaces, enabling enslavers to maximize the human cargo in the hold. Africans were forcibly packed into ships without any knowledge of their destination or the possibility of release. And while the voyage itself crossed the limits of inhumanity, the worst of all was yet to come for the slaves. Upon arrival at the port, the true torment for slaves began, except for those who were severely ill, left in the yard to perish from disease or hunger. The rest were exposed for sale. Healthy individuals were auctioned publicly, while the sickly were sold through a scramble. During this scramble, the ship was darkened by sails, and purchasers rushed in with the ferocity of beasts, seizing as many slaves as they desired. There were no effort made to prevent the separation of relatives or friends. Husbands and wives, parents and children were parted with as little concern as sheep and lambs by the butcher. The process of the slave trade became more and more inhumane with each step. The slaves were then categorized into different groups. The first group included those bought for plantation use, and the second group included indoor and outdoor slaves. Field slaves were summoned at daybreak for their tasks. Failure to comply resulted in flogging. Once they began work, they labored in rows, invariably under the whip of overseers, with each gang assigned a specific number of them. Their workday began at dawn, continuing with 2 breaks. One for 30 minutes in the morning, the other for 2 hours at noon until sunset. Additionally, they were required to roam and gather grass for the cattle, either during their 2-hour rest at noon or after the day's toils. Captain Hall, a Royal Navy officer from the 1760s to the 1780s. Sir G. Young, 1837 to 1930, 3rd Baronet and administrator, noted that women often suffered miscarriages due to the harsh treatment they endured. Captain Hall, a Royal Navy officer from the 1760s to the 1780s, wrote about witnessing a woman seated to breastfeed her child being abruptly forced from that position by a harsh blow from the cart whip. During the season, known as out of crop, the account of their labor was limited. However, in the crop season, during the duration of their work was much longer. They were compelled to work for as long as they were physically able, which often meant working until they could no longer stay awake or stand. Sometimes, due to extreme fatigue, they even fell asleep while working. In such instances, those who operate the mills have had their arms caught and torn off. Additionally, it should be noted that on some plantations, slaves were granted Sunday and Saturday afternoons as their own time. On other estates, they only received Sunday off, while on some, they had only a portion of Sunday free. Furthermore, during the crop season, on no estate were they provided more than Sunday for tending to their own lands. Even after putting in this amount of hard work, the slaves' food seemed to be without any consistent rules. Some estates offered slaves land to cultivate, while others provided them with provisions such as food. In some cases, slaves received both land and provisions. The most generous allowance is observed in Barbados, where the slaves generally seem to be poorly nourished, with each receiving 1 pint of grain for 24 hours, sometimes supplemented with half of a rotten herring. Even when the herring was deemed unsuitable for the white population, they were purchased for the slaves. Typically, the maximum allowance consisted of 9 pints of corn and 1 pound of salt fish per week. The fact that both Africans and Creoles resorted to eating the putrid carcasses of animals due to insufficient food serves as stark proof of the oppression they faced. Having described the condition of the plantation, it's important to touch on the situation of the indoor and outdoor slaves. Indoor slaves generally received better clothing and food and endured less labor compared to those on the plantation. However, due to constant exposure to the cruelty and whims of their masters and mistresses, their lives became so miserable that they often wished to be sent to the fields. Outdoor slaves, such as porters and coopers, were required to bring a certain sum to their masters every day. The usual punishment inflicted on the slaves involved the whip and cowskin. The cowskin whip was typically crafted from plaited cowskin with a thick, strong lash. It was such a fearsome tool that some overseers could remove skin from a horse's back with it. There are accounts of overseers leaving marks so deep that they could cut into a wooden board. These wounds were sometimes so severe that you could insert your finger into them, leaving scars that time cannot erase. Moving on to the extraordinary punishments, the infliction of which reveals the depths of malice, fury, and the darkest aspects of human nature. One such practice involved dropping hot lead onto the slaves, a method witnessed by a planter named Rushi in Jamaica. Within a span of 3 years, this man's cruelty led to the demise of 40 out of 60 enslaved individuals. The details of his other actions were deemed too horrendous to be revealed to the world and were thus suppressed by the House of Commons. This narrative unveils the sheer misery and suffering endured by the enslaved, exposing the depths of human depravity. It also makes us wonder how many other instances like this have been buried. In terms of ordinary punishments, slaves were often subjected to punishment for reasons like not arriving in the field on time, failing to gather enough grass, lingering too long on errands, and even theft, which was sometimes driven by hunger. Extraordinary punishments, however, were even more severe. They included punishment for running away, breaking a plate, or being forced to confess during moments of anger. Horrifyingly, there have been many instances where punishments were based on false accusations made by the master to conceal his own wrongdoing. Women punished their slaves for various reasons, such as being found pregnant, not bringing home enough money from prostitution, or without even providing a reason. The punishments these enslaved people had to suffer were drastic. They were cruel for no reason, and it was just the hatred for their skin color that their masters harbored. But the hardships didn't end there. After the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people started coming forward to tell how they were treated, they were labeled as liars and their struggles were invalidated. In an interview with Andrew Boone for the WPA's Slave Narrative Collection in 1930, matter-of-factly described the practice. By this time, the blood sometimes would be running down their heels. Then the next thing was a wash in salt water strong enough to hold up an egg. American slavery was barbaric and cruel. There were no bounds for their inhumanity that the masters showed, the pain they inflicted, and the damage they gave. The only thing that their masters cared about was the wealth and power that slaves brought. The business of the domestic slave trade was deeply woven into every corner of the American economy. Profits from the trade of enslaved people reached various destinations. Traders weren't the sole beneficiaries. Slave owners in the Upper South gained cash by selling individuals, while those in the Lower South profited by employing the people they bought in highly productive cotton and sugar fields. Merchants who supplied clothing and food to the slave traders also profited, along with steamboat, railroad, and ship owners who transported enslaved individuals. Capitalists in the North found profit by investing in banks that facilitated the exchange of money for people, or in insurance companies that insured the owner's investments in enslaved individuals. Foreign investors also benefited from Southern securities, some of which were backed by mortgaged slaves. Ironically, New England, the hotbed of American abolitionism, was also home to America's cotton textile industry, which amassed wealth from the labor of enslaved people forced to pick cotton. It led to another torturous period for the slaves. Now, they weren't only exposed to hard labor and inhumane punishments, but they were now being bred. The history of the United States from colonial times to the Civil War highlights the practice of slave breeding. The growth of cotton cultivation and the end of the international slave trade raised the demand for slaves in the Southwest, leading to higher slave prices across the South. According to Ned and Constant Sublette, authors of The American Slave Coast, slaveholders in the Chesapeake region reacted to these increased prices by breeding and selling slaves to traders for markets in the South. Slave breeding was a common practice in slave states of the United States, where slave owners systemically forced the reproduction of slaves to boost their profits. They involved coercing sexual relations, made male slaves and women or girls, forcing pregnancies on female slaves, and giving preference to women or young girls who could produce a large number of children. The goal was to increase the slave population without having to purchase more slaves and to address labor shortages resulting from the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. The ban on importing slaves into the United States after 1808 restricted the supply of slaves. This occurred alongside the invention of the cotton gin, which facilitated the expansion of cotton cultivation in the uplands, particularly in the Deep South's Black Belt region. As cotton farming expanded, so did the demand for labor, leading to a significant rise in the internal slave market. Meanwhile, the Upper South had surplus slaves due to a shift towards less labor-intense mixed-crop agriculture. To bolster the supply of slaves, slaveholders focused on the fertility of slave women as part of their productivity. They intermittently forced women into having large numbers of children. During this era, terms like breeders, breeding slaves, childbearing women, breeding period, and too old to breed became commonplace, highlighting the dehumanization nature of the practice. Planters in the Upper South states began selling slaves to the Deep South, often through slave traders like Franklin and Armfield. Louisville, Kentucky, situated on the Ohio River, emerged as a significant slave market and port for transporting slaves downstream via the Mississippi River to the south. New Orleans boasted the largest slave market in the nation and by 1840 had become the fourth largest city in the U.S. and the wealthiest, primarily due to its thriving slave trade and related industries. During the antebellum period, many escaped slaves shared their experiences in books known as slave narratives. These accounts revealed that a significant number of slave owners regularly meddled in the sexual lives of their slaves, particularly the women. The narratives documented instances of rape, forced matings, arranged marriages, sexual abuse by masters, their sons, or overseers, and various other forms of exploitation endured by slave women. The historical E. Franklin Frazier, in his book The Negro Family, stated that there were masters who, without any regard for the preferences of their slaves, made it their human chattel as they did their stock. Ex-slave Maggie Stenhouse remarked, "During slavery, they were stockmen. They were weighted and tested. A man would rent the stockman and put him in a room with some young women he wanted to raise children from." Throughout these years, there were many instances when enslaved people fought to regain their freedom. They knew how it felt to be free, and they wanted to feel it again. In September 1739, a group of enslaved Africans led by Jimmy rebelled in the South Carolina colony, killing 2 storekeepers and seizing weapons along the Stono River near Charleston. They aimed to reach Spanish Florida, where they were promised freedom to defend against British attacks. This rebellion, known as the Stono Rebellion, was the largest uprising of enslaved people in the mainland British colonies. About 60 to 100 black individuals participated, resulting in the deaths of approximately 40 black individuals and 20 white individuals, with others captured. In response, South Carolina lawmakers enacted a 10-year ban on importing enslaved Africans and passed the Negro Act of 1740, which restricted assembly, education, and movement among the enslaved. The Stono Rebellion was just one of several uprisings during the 246 years of slavery in the United States. As time passed, the desire for freedom grew stronger and stronger in the hearts of enslaved people. The Civil War in the United States erupted in 1861 due to escalating tensions between northern and southern states over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 prompted 7 southern states to secede and establish the Confederate States of America, with 4 additional states soon joining them. Known as the War Between the States, the Civil War concluded with the Confederate surrender in 1865. This conflict proved to be the costliest and deadliest war ever fought on American soil, resulting in the deaths of approximately 620,000 out of 2.4 million soldiers, with millions more sustaining injuries and significant destruction across much of the South. This war freed nearly 4 million slaves, but the biggest hurdle was yet to come. Hundreds of thousands of freed slaves perished from disease and hunger after being liberated during the American Civil War, as stated in a new book by historian Jim Downs of Connecticut College. This analysis makes us question one of the most revered narratives of the American history, which portrays the emancipation of slaves as a victorious correction of the injustice perpetrated by the Southern plantation system, where millions of black Americans were enslaved. In his book, Sick from Freedom, historian Jim Downs reveals that the reality of emancipation during the turmoil of war and its aftermath often fell far short of the positive image portrayed in history. Instead, freed slaves were frequently neglected by Union soldiers or confronted with widespread disease, including devastating outbreaks of smallpox and cholera. Many perished from starvation. Through meticulous examination of obscure records, newspapers, and journals, Downs estimated that approximately a quarter of the 4 million freed slaves either died or suffered from illness between 1862 and 1870. He describes this period as the largest biological crisis of the 19th century, yet it has received little attention from the contemporary historians. Downs' book recounts harrowing stories of individual slave families who embraced their newfound freedom from the harsh plantations where they were born or sold. Many found themselves in encampments known as contraband camps, often situated near Union Army bases. However, these camps were characterized by unsanitary conditions and limited food supplies. Shockingly, some contraband camps had previously served as slave pens, meaning newly freed individuals found themselves confined once again in the very cells where they had been held captive. In these camps, rapid disease and hunger resulted in countless deaths. Tragically, for many, the only means of leaving the camp was to agree to return to work on the same plantations from which they had recently escaped. The goal of slavery wasn't just labor, but to establish the dominance of one race. Every move was calculated, and they knew what they were doing. The struggle of the enslaved people serves as a stark reminder of what humans are capable of. It is ugly and unfortunate. We will never be able to uncover what happened or to what extent were the slaves tortured. Many accounts have been buried deep down in history, and it might never be possible to understand what the slaves went through. The blood and sweat of these slaves fueled the economy, yet they were neglected the most. That's all for today. We'll meet in another video. Until then, make sure you have subscribed to our channel and turned on the notifications to never miss a new update.